The heat arrived before the flame, a warning that traveled through concrete and coral, through the packed earth and sandbags, through the very air itself. Private First Class Kenji Yamamoto felt it first as a change in pressure, then as a wall of superheated wind that made his lungs seize. He was 23 years old, pressed against the rear wall of Bunker 47 on the northwestern ridge of Peleliu Island, and he had exactly 14 seconds left to understand what was happening to him. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The bunker had been his home for 6 days. 6 days of incoming artillery that shook dust from the ceiling in golden cascades. 6 days of watching the ocean through the firing slit, that impossible blue contrasting with the black smoke that rose from the beach where American Marines had been dying in waves since September 15th. It was now the 21st, and the Americans had changed their tactics. Kenji didn't know this yet. None of them did. Corporal Tanaka was the first to see it. A shape moving through the smoke outside, bulky and wrong, like a man wearing the shell of some mechanical demon. "What is that?" Hiroshi's voice cracked on the last word. He was 26, from Osaka, and he had a daughter he'd never met, born 3 months after he shipped out. Her name was Yuki. Snow. He carried a photograph of his wife holding a bundle of blankets, and he would look at it every night before sleep, trying to imagine the face he'd never seen. Private Takeshi Kobayashi, 19 years old and barely past his training, pressed his eye to the secondary firing port. "It's a Marine, but he's carrying... I don't understand what he's carrying." The thing on the Marine's back was cylindrical, connected by hoses to a wand he held in both hands. The Marine moved with purpose, flanked by 2 others with rifles. They were advancing on Bunker 47 with the kind of confidence that came from knowing something their enemy didn't. Behind them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, that same merciless blue that had watched empires rise and fall on these volcanic islands for millennia. Sergeant Masaru Ishida, the bunker's commander at 32, moved to the main firing slit. His hands were steady, they always were, but something cold had settled in his stomach. He'd been in Manchuria before this. He'd seen what modern warfare could do to the human body. He'd learned that survival often came down to recognizing danger before it revealed itself fully. "Load all weapons," he said quietly. "Target the one with the apparatus." There were 8 men in Bunker 47. 8 men who had been strangers once, thrown together by war and geography and the Emperor's will, who had become something like family in the way that shared terror creates bonds. They had fought together through the initial landing, had held this ridge while others fell, had rationed water and ammunition and hope in equal measure. Private Daiichi Suzuki, 24, a fisherman's son from Hokkaido, worked the bolt on his Arisaka rifle. His hands still remembered the feel of nets, the weight of the catch, the way the boat would move beneath his feet in the early morning. He wondered if his father was still fishing, or if the war had taken those waters too. "The Americans are getting bolder," he said, settling the rifle against his shoulder. "Or more desperate," replied Lieutenant Akira Watanabe, the bunker's second in command, 29, educated at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, fluent in English, which he'd learned from his mother who'd spent years in California before the Troubles. He sometimes dreamed in English now, which felt like a betrayal. "They're not running out of anything," he said. "They're learning." The Marine with the apparatus was 30 meters away now. 25. 20. "Fire!" Sergeant Ishida commanded. The bunker erupted with the crack of rifles. Kenji squeezed his trigger, felt the familiar kick against his shoulder, and saw dust kick up near the Marine's feet. But the American didn't fall. The 2 riflemen with him returned fire, and bullets sparked against the bunker's firing slit, forcing the Japanese soldiers back. "He's still coming," Takeshi said, and there was something new in his voice. Fear, yes, but also confusion. The Americans usually took cover when fired upon. This one advanced like he was invulnerable, like he knew something they didn't. 15 meters. The Marine raised the wand, pointing it at the bunker's main entrance. For a moment, nothing happened. In that moment, Corporal Tanaka thought of his daughter, Yuki, wondered what color her eyes were. Kenji thought of the cherry trees near his family's home in Kyoto, how they'd be blooming now, painting the world in pink and white. Daiichi remembered the taste of his mother's miso soup, the way steam would rise from the bowl on cold mornings. Then, the world became fire. The flame that emerged from the M2 flamethrower traveled at nearly 100 miles per hour. It was a mixture of gasoline and oil, ignited by a spark at the nozzle, transformed into a liquid jet of fire that could reach 45 meters. But the Marine was only 10 meters away, and he directed the stream with practiced precision directly through the bunker's entrance. The flame didn't just enter, it filled, it expanded. It consumed oxygen and space and hope in a single, catastrophic moment. The temperature inside Bunker 47 rose from 85 degrees Fahrenheit to over 3,000 degrees in less than 2 seconds. The air itself ignited. Kenji's last coherent thought was that this must be what hell felt like. Not the mythical hell of Buddhist teaching, but a hell made by human hands. Scientific and precise, and utterly without mercy. He tried to scream, but the superheated air seared his lungs. His uniform, soaked with 6 days of sweat, ignited. His rifle, clutched in burning hands, became too hot to hold. Sergeant Yoshida, positioned furthest from the entrance, survived longest, perhaps 4 seconds. Long enough to see his men die. Long enough to understand, finally, what the apparatus was. Long enough to know that everything they'd been taught about fortification and defense had become obsolete in the span of a single technological leap. His last act was to reach for the grenade on his belt, thinking perhaps to take the Marine with him. But his fingers wouldn't obey anymore. The nerves were already dead. Takeshi died reaching for the photograph of his younger sister. Daiichi died with his hands over his ears, as if the sound was worse than the fire. Lieutenant Watanabe died standing, facing the flame, his English language education no protection against this purely American innovation. Corporal Tanaka died whispering his daughter's name, Yuki, 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 the word burning in his throat. The flame lasted 7 seconds. The Marines called it giving them a squirt. 7 seconds to transform 8 living men into charred remains, to fill a bunker with smoke and the sweet, terrible smell of burning flesh, to end 8 futures and 8 histories and all the small hopes that make a human life worth living. When the Marine cut the flame, the silence that followed was worse than the roar had been. He stepped to the side, nodded to his companions, and they moved forward to confirm the kill. Standard procedure. The Marine's name was Private James O'Brien from South Boston, and this was his 14th bunker in 3 days. He was 20 years old, and at night he couldn't sleep without seeing the flames reflected in his closed eyes. He'd volunteered for flamethrower duty because it meant $50 extra pay a month, and he'd been saving to marry his girl back home, Catherine, with the red hair and the laugh that sounded like music. He didn't look inside Bunker 47. He never looked inside. That was the only way to keep doing the job. But on the ridge above, in Bunker 52, another 8 men had watched everything. They had seen the Marine approach. They had heard their comrades' rifles firing. They had seen the flame, that impossible jet of liquid fire, and they had heard, though they would never speak of this, the screams that lasted exactly 3.5 seconds before the oxygen was consumed and the throats that made them cease to function. Corporal Yoshi Nakamura,
age 25, commander of Bunker 52, slowly stepped back from the observation slit. His face had gone the color of ash. "Send a runner to headquarters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell them the Americans have brought demons. Tell them our bunkers are not safe. Tell them—" But what could he tell them? That in 30 seconds, he'd counted, his military training overriding his horror. Everything they'd believed about static defense had been incinerated? That the coral and concrete that had taken weeks to prepare, that had withstood artillery and bombs and conventional assault, was useless against this new weapon? Private Ren Fujimoto, just 18, the youngest in the bunker, was crying silently. He'd trained with Takeshi Kobayashi. They'd been in the same unit since basic training. Takeshi had promised to teach Ren how to navigate by the stars, the way fishermen did. That promise was ash now, settled among the remains in Bunker 47. "We can't fight this," Ren said. "How do we fight this?" No one answered. They watched as the American squad moved on, the Marine with the flamethrower walking with that same purposeful gait, the tanks on his back still half full. There were dozens more bunkers on this ridge, dozens more targets. The mathematics of it was simple and terrible. In the command post, 200 meters inland, Colonel Kunio Nakabawa received the report. He was 43, a veteran of China, a man who'd seen the evolution of warfare from cavalry charges to mechanized assault. He read the runner's message twice, his expression unchanging. Then he looked at his operations officer, Major Tairo Yamashita. "Flamethrowers," the major said. He'd heard rumors of these weapons, used sporadically in earlier campaigns, but never with this efficiency, never with this devastating speed. 30 seconds, Colonel Nakagawa said. He stood, walked to the map on the wall, Peleliu Island, with its defensive positions marked in red, American advances in blue. The blue was everywhere now, pushing inland, and each blue arrow represented not just territory lost, but men dead, positions overrun. 30 seconds to eliminate an 8-man position. How many flamethrowers do they have? Intelligence suggests at least 12 in each Marine battalion. There are 3 battalions on the island.
Mathematics again. Simple and terrible. Send orders to all bunker positions. Maintain watch for the flamethrower teams. Target them first, at maximum range. They must carry additional ammunition for the device. Perhaps it can be detonated. But Major Yamashita knew, as did the colonel, that this was desperation talking. The flamethrower Marines were well protected, moving in coordinated teams. Hitting them at range, with the Americans' suppressive fire and armor support, would be nearly impossible. Before Bunker 47 became a tomb, before the fire that redefined modern warfare for 8 men who would never tell anyone what they'd learned, there had been life. Not the careful, rationed existence of combat, but the full, complicated, beautiful life that war interrupts but never completely erases. Kenji Yamamoto had been a student before the draft. 23 years old, 3rd year at Kyoto Imperial University, studying literature with a focus on classical poetry. His father thought this impractical. Poetry won't feed a family, he'd said more than once. But his mother had always defended him. The world needs beauty, she'd say, and she'd smile in that way that made Kenji believe, for a moment, that maybe his father was wrong. Maybe the world did need people who could find the perfect words to describe the way moonlight fell on water, or how cherry blossoms seemed to hold within them both life and the promise of death. He'd been reading Basho the night before he received his draft notice. The famous haiku about the old pond, the frog jumping, the sound of water. He'd been trying to understand why those 17 syllables could carry such weight, why they could make his chest feel tight with something he couldn't name. He never figured it out. The draft notice arrived, and there was no time for poetry anymore. Only for training, for learning how to kill, for being shipped to an island whose name he couldn't pronounce. But he'd brought a small book with him, Basho's collected works, bound in cloth that his mother had wrapped herself. It was against regulations. Personal items were discouraged. Space was limited. But Kenji had hidden it in his pack, and somehow it had survived the journey. Survived the initial landing. Survived 6 days in Bunker 47. It would not survive the 7th. In the weeks before Peleliu, when they'd been stationed in the Peleliu Islands preparing for the American assault they all knew was coming, Kenji had established a routine. Every evening, after the day's fortification work was done, after the thin soup that passed for dinner, after the officers had stopped shouting instructions about fields of fire and ammunition conservation, he would find a quiet spot and read one poem. Just one. He would read it 3 times. Once quickly, once slowly, once with his eyes closed, letting the words live in his mind. Then he would try to see what Basho had seen, feel what Basho had felt. It was Corporal Tanaka who first discovered him doing this. Tanaka had been making his evening rounds, checking on the men, making sure no one was falling into the kind of despair that made soldiers unreliable. He'd found Kenji sitting on a pile of sandbags, book open, lips moving silently. "What are you reading?" Tanaka had asked, not unkindly. He was older than most of them, 26, and he had a gentleness about him that war hadn't yet scraped away. Kenji had looked up, startled, ready to hide the book, but something in Tanaka's face made him honest. "Poetry, Corporal, just poetry." Tanaka had sat down beside him, uninvited but not unwelcome. "Read me one." And so Kenji had read, "In the cicada's cry, no sign can foretell how soon it must die." They'd sat in silence after that, listening to the actual cicadas in the trees around them, loud and insistent, unaware of their own mortality. Finally Tanaka had spoken. "I have a daughter I've never met, Yuki. My wife writes that she cries at night sometimes, for no reason babies cry. I think about that poem, about the cicada, about how we never know how soon." After that night, it became a ritual. Kenji would read, and whoever was nearby would listen. Sometimes it was just Tanaka. Sometimes others joined, Daichi, who pretended not to care but always stayed for the whole poem, Takeshi, who was too young to pretend anything and listened with wide eyes. Even Sergeant Ishida once or twice, standing at the edge of the group, arms crossed, but listening. Kenji would never have called himself brave. He shook during artillery barrages. He vomited the first time he saw a man die, during the initial American landing. He wrote letters home that he never sent because they would only frighten his mother. But poetry, this was where he found courage. In the act of finding beauty, of insisting that beauty still mattered, even here, even now, especially here, especially now. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka's routine was different but no less essential. Every night before sleep, he would take out the photograph of his wife, Michiko, holding their daughter. The photograph was bent now, softened by moisture and handling, the edges fraying. But the image was still clear. Michiko, 24 years old, looking at the camera with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and joy, and in her arms a bundle of blankets with the suggestion of a tiny face. Tanaka would hold the photograph and try to will the image to move, to show him more. "Show me her eyes. Let me see if she has her mother's nose. Does she smile? Does she have all her fingers and toes?" The photograph never revealed more than it held, but Tanaka looked anyway, every single night. During the day, he was Corporal Tanaka, efficient, reliable, the man Sergeant Ishida trusted to keep the others steady. He checked ammunition counts. He supervised the reinforcement of the bunker's walls. He made sure the firing slits were clear and the backup positions were prepared. He wrote reports and delivered messages and did all the small, unglamorous work that kept 8 men alive in a concrete box on a hostile ridge. But at night, he was just Hiroshi, a man who worked in a textile factory before the war, who met Michiko at a neighborhood festival. who married her after a courtship that his friends said was too short, but that felt to him like exactly the right length of time. A man who'd gotten the news of his daughter's birth via telegram, 3 lines of text that had made him cry in front of his entire unit. Daughter born, stop. Mother and child healthy, stop. Named Yuki, stop. Snow. They'd agreed on the name before he left. If a girl, Yuki. If a boy, Hiro. Snow or abundance. Either way, a hope for the future. Tanaka had routines within routines. He wrote letters to Yuki, even though she couldn't read yet, even though she might never read them. He wrote about the island, but not the fighting. He wrote about the ocean, how it was a blue he'd never seen before. He wrote about the other men, giving them nicknames she might find funny someday. He wrote about what he hoped to teach her, how to ride a bicycle, how to make paper cranes, how to be kind, even when the world wasn't. He never mailed these letters. Mail service to the island was sporadic at best, and letters from here often never arrived, shot down with the planes that carried them, sunk with the ships, lost in the vast logistics network that tried to connect soldiers to the homes they'd left behind. So the letters accumulated in his pack, 37 of them by the time September 21st arrived, each one a small piece of his heart translated into words his daughter might someday hold in her hands. In the evenings, when there was time, Tanaka would teach the younger soldiers things their fathers might have taught them if war hadn't interrupted. He taught Takeshi how to tie knots properly, the kind that wouldn't slip under pressure. He taught Ren how to keep his rifle clean in humid conditions, how moisture was the enemy of machinery. He taught them songs from Osaka, work songs that his grandfather had sung in the fields, rhythm and melody that made the day pass faster. "Why do you do this?" Takeshi had asked once. "Teach us things. We might not need to know them." Tanaka had looked at the boy, because that's what Takeshi was, really, just a boy in a soldier's uniform, and said something he'd been thinking for a long time. Because if we stop learning, if we stop growing, then we've already lost. Not the war. Ourselves. We've lost ourselves, and I won't accept that. Not yet. Private Takeshi Kobayashi's routine was the most fragile because he barely had time to establish one. 19 years old, drafted 6 months ago, trained for 3, shipped out, and now here. Everything was new. Everything was terrifying. Everything was too much and not enough simultaneously. Before the war, Takeshi had worked in his family's small shop in Nagoya. They sold kitchen goods, pots, pans, knives, dishes, all the ordinary things that made a household function. It was boring work, and Takeshi had spent most of his time dreaming of escape, of adventure, of a life larger than the one his family had planned for him. His father wanted him to take over the shop eventually. His mother wanted him to marry the daughter of their neighbors, a nice girl named Sumiko, who helped in her family's restaurant and who Takeshi found perfectly pleasant and perfectly uninteresting. The war had seemed at first like the escape he'd been craving, a chance to see the world, to test himself, to become someone other than the shopkeeper's son who couldn't decide which brand of rice cooker to recommend to customers. But war, Takeshi discovered, was not an adventure. It was tedious stretches of boredom, punctuated by moments of pure terror. It was learning that the human body was fragile in ways he'd never imagined. It was discovering that bravery wasn't about fearlessness, but about continuing to function while absolutely terrified. It was missing his mother's cooking, missing his own bed, missing the boring safety of a life where the only important decision was whether to order more inventory. Takeshi's routine in the brief time he had to establish one centered on his sister, Aiko, 16 years old, still in school, still innocent of what the world could do to people. He'd promised her he'd return with stories, with souvenirs, with proof that their quiet life in Nagoya wasn't the only life worth living. He carried a photograph of her, Aiko in her school uniform, smiling at something outside the frame. Every morning, before the day truly began,
Takeshi would look at that photograph and make a promise. I'll come home. I'll tell you everything. I'll make you understand why I had to go. Except he was starting to realize he didn't understand why he had to go. The patriotic speeches, the talk of destiny and empire and righteous cause, all of it seemed thin now, insubstantial, unable to stand up against the reality of men screaming as they died, of friends vanishing in clouds of coral dust and blood. Takeshi had started writing a journal, another routine. Not letters. He couldn't send the truth to Aiko, couldn't burden her with the reality of what he was experiencing. But a journal maybe. Something honest. Something that, if he died, might help her understand. Or maybe help her forgive him for leaving in the first place. September 17th, he'd written on one of the first nights in Bunker 47. The Americans landed today. We fired until our barrels were hot. I think I killed someone. I'm not sure. I aimed where Sergeant Ishida told me to aim, and I pulled the trigger when he told me to pull it, and something fell in the smoke. Was it a man? Was it the man I killed? I threw up after. Daichi said that's normal, that everyone does it the first time. But I don't.
Feel normal? I feel like I've crossed a line I can't uncross, like I'm on the wrong side of something essential and I can't find my way back. But he'd kept firing, kept following orders, kept trying to be a good soldier, because that's what she did, that's what was expected. And Takeshi had spent his whole life meeting expectations, even when they were killing him. Private Daichi Suzuki, at 24, was old enough to know better, but young enough to still hope. He was a fisherman's son from Hokkaido, where the water was cold and the work was hard, and men measured their worth by their endurance. His hands were scarred from nets and hooks, his skin weathered by salt and wind, and he moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent his life working in motion, on boats, on docks, in the rhythm of tides. Daiichi's routine was physical. Every morning, before the others fully awoke, he would do exercises his father had taught him, push-ups, squats, stretches that kept the body flexible, that prevented the kind of stiffness that could get you killed in combat. A fisherman's body is his tool, his father had always said. You maintain your tools, or they fail when you need them most. So Daichi maintained himself. Even in the bunker, even with limited space, he found ways to move, to keep his body ready. The others teased him sometimes. Suzuki and his morning rituals, like he's training for a swim meet. But they also respected it. In a war that took so much control away, Daiichi's morning exercises were a reclamation of agency, an insistence that his body was still his own. But Daiichi's real routine, the one that kept him sane, was water. He collected it, rationed it, studied it. Water was life on the island, scarce, precious, worth more than ammunition sometimes. The Americans controlled the supply lines, and Japanese positions often went days without proper water rations. Men died of thirst as often as they died of bullets. Daiichi had learned in his fishing life to read water, to understand its moods, its depths, its promises and threats. On Peleliu, he applied these skills to survival. He knew how to collect condensation from the bunker's walls, how to purify questionable water using methods his grandfather had taught him. He kept a mental map of every water source within a kilometer, streams, wells, even the brackish pools and bomb craters. "You think about water the way other men think about women," Corporal Tanaka had joked once. "Water keeps you alive longer than women do in a place like this," Daiichi had replied, and everyone had laughed, even though it was true. But at night, Daiichi thought about the ocean, the real ocean, not the hostile blue that surrounded Peleliu, but the waters off Hokkaido, where he'd spent his youth. He thought about the weight of nets full of fish, the satisfaction of a good catch, the way the boat would sit lower in the water when the work was done well. He thought about his father, 60 years old now, still fishing, still maintaining his tools. Daiichi had a wife back home, Yumi. They'd married young, 18 and 17, because that's what you did in fishing families. Married young, had children, built a life around the rhythms of the sea. But there were no children yet. Yumi had lost 2 pregnancies, each one a small death that Daiichi felt like a physical weight. They'd been trying for 6 years when he was drafted. "When you come back," Yumi had said the day he left, "we'll try again. We'll have a whole school of children. We'll fill the house with noise and life." Daiichi had promised. And now in the bunker, he would lie awake and imagine it. Imagine returning. Imagine Yumi meeting him at the dock. Imagine children, 3, 4, 5 of them, learning to fish, learning to read the water, learning to maintain their tools. He would plan their names, plan their futures, plan a life that war kept interrupting, but that he refused to let go of completely. "Do you think we'll make it?" Takeshi had asked him once in one of those late-night conversations when truth became possible. Daiichi had been quiet for a long time. Then, "I think we'll make it as long as we remember what we're trying to make it back to. The moment we forget, that's when we're really lost." Lieutenant Akira Watanabe's routine was language. Every evening, he would spend 30 minutes reading and writing in English. It was both practice and resistance. Practice because skills deteriorate without use. Resistance because maintaining his mother's language felt like honoring her memory in a war that had made her heritage suspect. His mother had been Miyako Watanabe, born Miyako Chen, a second-generation immigrant who'd spent her childhood in Sacramento, California. She'd married Akira's father when both were students, and she'd moved to Japan, trading American sunshine for Japanese tradition. She taught Akira English as a gift, a window into another world.
"Language is never just language," she'd told him when he was young. "It's a way of thinking, a way of seeing. When you speak English, you see the world the way English speakers see it. When you speak Japanese, you see it differently. The more languages you know, the more worlds you can inhabit." His mother died when Akira was 16, and he'd mourned her in both languages, finding that grief in English felt different than grief in Japanese. English grief was more direct, more individualistic. Japanese grief was collective, contextual, wrapped in obligation and propriety. Both were real, both were necessary. At the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, Akira's English had made him useful. He'd been assigned to intelligence, translating captured American documents, interrogating prisoners. He'd done this work efficiently, professionally, trying not to think about how his mother would have felt about him using her gift this way. But in Bunker 47, away from the intelligence apparatus, Akira had reclaimed his English for himself. He kept a journal in English, partly for practice, partly because some thoughts seemed to require English to be properly expressed. September 18, he'd written. "The Marines fight differently than we expected. More aggressive, less concerned with casualties. They seem to believe in their supply lines, in their support, in their eventual victory. We believe in our duty, in our positions, in our ability to make them pay for every meter. 2 different philosophies of war. I wonder which one is right. I wonder if either one is." Akira's other routine was observation. He watched people, their habits, their fears, their coping mechanisms. As the second in command, this was partly his duty. He needed to know who was steady and who was breaking, who could be relied upon and who needed support. But it was also his nature. He'd always been a watcher, someone who understood people through study. He'd watched Kenji with his poetry and recognized a soul trying to maintain itself. He'd watched Tanaka with his photograph and seen a father's love becoming a lifeline. He'd watched Takeshi struggling with disillusionment and remembered his own younger self before the world had gotten complicated. He'd watched Daiichi's morning exercises and understood the need for ritual, for control, for the maintenance of self. and he'd watched Sergeant Ishida, trying to understand how a man carried so much responsibility without breaking. Ishida was 32, almost a father figure to some of them, and he bore the weight of 8 lives with a steadiness that seemed almost superhuman. How did he do it? How did he make decisions knowing that each one might kill someone? How did he sleep at night? "You watch us like we're specimens," Ishida had said to him once, not unkindly. "I watch you like you're human. In a war that wants us to be soldiers, weapons, tools, I watch to remember that we're human." Sergeant Masaru Ishida's routine was responsibility. Every night he would do a mental inventory, not of supplies, though he did that too, but of his men. Who ate enough today? Who seemed withdrawn? Who needed a word of encouragement? Who needed to be pushed? And who needed to be given space? Ishida had been a teacher before the war, mathematics, at a middle school in Hiroshima. He loved teaching, loved the moment when a student's eyes would light up with understanding, when numbers stopped being abstract and became tools for solving problems. War had seemed like a different kind of teaching men to survive, to fight, to endure. But war, he'd discovered, was mostly about limits. How much fear could a man endure before breaking? How much hunger? How much loss? How much responsibility could a commander carry before it crushed him? Ishida had learned in Manchuria that the answer was different for everyone. Some men had deep reserves of endurance. Others broke quickly, unpredictably, like glass under invisible pressure. His job was to know his men well enough to predict their limits and to redistribute stress before anyone shattered completely. In Bunker 47, this meant small interventions. It meant asking Kenji to read poetry aloud because it centered him. It meant giving Tanaka responsibilities that let him feel like a father, protective and useful. It meant pairing Takeshi with Daichi on watch, because Daichi's steadiness helped calm Takeshi's anxiety. It meant talking with Akira about strategy and philosophy, because Akira needed intellectual engagement to stay sharp.
The heat arrived before the flame, a warning that traveled through concrete and coral, through the packed earth and sandbags, through the very air itself. Private First Class Kenji Yamamoto felt it first as a change in pressure, then as a wall of superheated wind that made his lungs seize. He was 23 years old, pressed against the rear wall of Bunker 47 on the northwestern ridge of Peleliu Island, and he had exactly 14 seconds left to understand what was happening to him. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The bunker had been his home for 6 days, 6 days of incoming artillery that shook dust from the ceiling in golden cascades, 6 days of watching the ocean through the firing slit, that impossible blue contrasting with the black smoke that rose from the beach where American Marines had been dying in waves since September 15th. It was now the 21st, and the Americans had changed their tactics. Kenji didn't know this yet. None of them did. Corporal Tanaka was the first to see it, a shape moving through the smoke outside, bulky and wrong, like a man wearing the shell of some mechanical demon. "What is that?" Hiroshi's voice cracked on the last word. He was 26, from Osaka, and he had a daughter he'd never met, born 3 months after he shipped out. Her name was Yuki, Snow. He carried a photograph of his wife holding a bundle of blankets, and he would look at it every night before sleep, trying to imagine the face he'd never seen. Private Takeshi Kobayashi, 19 years old and barely past his training, pressed his eye to the secondary firing port. "It's a Marine, but he's carrying... I don't understand what he's carrying." The thing on the Marine's back was cylindrical, connected by hoses to a wand he held in both hands. The Marine moved with purpose, flanked by 2 others with rifles. They were advancing on Bunker 47 with the kind of confidence that came from knowing something their enemy didn't. Behind them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, that same merciless blue that had watched empires rise and fall on these volcanic islands for millennia. Sergeant Masaru Ishida, the bunker's commander, at 32, moved to the main firing slit. His hands were steady, they always were, but something cold had settled in his stomach. He'd been in Manchuria before this. He'd seen what modern warfare could do to the human body. He'd learned that survival often came down to recognizing danger before it revealed itself fully. "Load all weapons," he said quietly. "Target the one with the apparatus." There were 8 men in Bunker 47, 8 men who had been strangers once, thrown together by war and geography and the Emperor's will, who had become something like family in the way that shared terror creates bonds. They had fought together through the initial landing, had held this ridge while others fell, had rationed water and ammunition and hope in equal measure. Private Daiichi Suzuki, 24 years old, a fisherman's son from Hokkaido, worked the bolt on his Arisaka rifle. His hands still remembered the feel of nets, the weight of the catch, the way the boat would move beneath his feet in the early morning. He wondered if his father was still fishing, or if the war had taken those waters too. "The Americans are getting bolder," he said, settling the rifle against his shoulder. "Or more desperate," replied Lieutenant Akira Watanabe, the bunker's second-in-command, 29, educated at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, fluent in English, which he'd learned from his mother, who'd spent years in California before the Troubles. He sometimes dreamed in English now, which felt like a betrayal. "They've been throwing themselves at this ridge for days. Maybe they're running out of men." But Sergeant Ishida knew better. He'd seen the ships offshore, an armada that seemed to have no end. He'd watched the aircraft that owned the sky, the endless supply chains that fed the American war machine. "They're not running out of anything," he said. "They're learning." The Marine with the apparatus was 30 meters away now. 25. 20. "Fire!" Sergeant Ishida commanded. The bunker erupted with the crack of rifles. Kenji squeezed his trigger, felt the familiar kick against his shoulder, saw dust kick up near the Marine's feet. But the Marine didn't fall. The 2 riflemen with him returned fire, and bullets sparked against the bunker's firing slit, forcing the Japanese soldiers back. "He's still coming," Takeshi said, and there was something new in his voice. Fear, yes, but also confusion. The Americans usually took cover when fired upon. This one advanced like he was invulnerable, like he knew something they didn't. 15 meters.
Ishida's own limit? He didn't know. He'd never reached it. Or maybe he had and just pushed through. The way you push through pain when there was no choice. He had nightmares. Manchuria haunted him. Villages burning, civilians caught between armies, the kind of moral complexity that peacetime never prepared you for. But he functioned. He led. He made decisions. His routine was also letters. He wrote to his wife, Reiko, and his 2 sons, Takeshi and Masa, 12 and 9. But unlike Tanaka's letters to his daughter, Ishida's letters were carefully constructed, edited, cleansed of anything that might frighten or sadden. They were letters from a different war, a cleaner war, a war where father would definitely come home. "Dear Reiko, dear Takeshi, dear Masa," he'd written just yesterday. "The island is beautiful in its way. Coral formations like sculptures, and the ocean is a blue I wish I could show you. The men are well. We have challenges, but we face them together. I think of you every day. I imagine Takeshi helping you with the garden, and Masa reading to you in the evenings. I imagine our home, and it gives me strength. I will return to you. This is not a promise I make lightly. It is a promise I will keep." But after writing these letters, Ishida would also write another kind. Letters he never sent, would never send. Letters that told the truth. "Dear Reiko, I am so tired. Not physically, the body endures, but the soul. How many decisions can one man make before each one becomes impossible? Today I chose who would go for water and who would stay. Tomorrow I'll choose who stands watch and who rests. Each choice affects who lives and who dies, that we pretend otherwise. How many of these choices add up to something unforgivable? These truthful letters he burned, always, one by one, watching the paper blacken and curl, the words disappearing into smoke. It was catharsis. It was necessary. It was his routine. The morning of September 21st began like the 6 mornings before it, with the sound of distant artillery, the smell of coral dust and cordite, and the peculiar light that came through the bunker's firing slits, turning everything golden and unreal. Then came the heat, the warning that traveled through concrete and coral. And in 14 seconds, everything that made these 8 men human, their routines, their memories, their futures, became ash. The poetry burned, the photograph burned, the letters burned, the promises burned. Only the war continued, indifferent to the small deaths it required, moving forward with the terrible mathematics of conquest.